Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones, the unvisited ones, the cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome to the show Dr. Daniel Fohr. In addition to being an initiate of multiple global spiritual traditions, he is also a doctor of psychology and licensed psychotherapist. He joins us today to talk about one of his particular specialities, ancestral healing. Daniel, welcome aboard.
It's good to be here, Gordon. Thanks.
Yeah. This is absolutely going to be a fun chat. It's timed quite well with some of the work the premium members are doing at the moment. And so we, without very much further ado, we'll jump into the traditional first question. Daniel, were you a weird kid?
You know, we don't always have the most objective assessment of ourselves, but I don't think I was unusually weird until I started eating psychoactive substances as a teenager. Before that, I liked being in nature and was actually pretty well adjusted, which is not very hip these days. And I did have some things get cracked open once I crossed paths with LSD. But before that, I think I was kind of normal. I know it's embarrassing, but I was.
No, well, there are sort of different ways into, you know, how we all end up here. And that's a fairly classic one. You grew up in Ohio, didn't you?
I did, in the Black River watershed, a feeder creek to the Black River, just south of Lake Erie. So what used to be swampy, I think traditional Miami, Wyandotte, eventually Iroquois territory. But my ancestors are early German, English, Irish, settler, colonialist of Pennsylvania, then Ohio. So, yeah.
Gotcha. And given the course your life took, and we'll get to the psychedelics in a minute, I mean, did you... were your parents in any way weird? Like when you started going weird?
No, they weren't. They were actually kind of normal and pretty loving. And I was marginally Christian for a minute, and then I started reading Nietzsche, and then that fell apart. And then I started learning about ritual and paganism and shamanism and, you know, beat poet literature and all kinds of stuff, as even in high school, and then had the good fortune when I was 17 to connect with teachers of shamanic pagan practice. So I got a framework for consciously, intentionally relating with the spirits of plants and animals and deities, even as a teenager, which was a great circumstance because it set me on a path of training with teachers for most of the last 25 years. And teachers are, you know, spiritual teachers are often a hot mess, but I've learned a ton and crashed around a lot and did a PhD in psychology and a degree in religious studies and lived on a few continents, and I've been motivated to get knocked around by teachers and traditions for a couple decades.
Yeah, so coming back to getting a framework at 17, that was presumably after the psychedelic experience. So that's typically, we like to find the inciting incident for these kind of things. So was that the LSD? Yeah. Was it mushrooms? What's your experience of it?
I was kind of a stoner in high school, and I worked. Yeah, sure, I had mushrooms, LSD, and stuff. But what was interesting about it is pretty early on in those experiences, I had a sense not just of things being cracked open, but of being pushed back. Like I was, you know, pushy as maybe a lot of young people are, but there was a sense of being pushed back, like pushing, and then oh, there's other things that aren't me, that I can't see in an outer kind of physical way, but which are quite real. Okay, I don't have a category for this. Seeking framework. And so I read like Michael Harner's stuff and basic, you know, ritual paganism books, and started to just acquire a framework and realized that there was a lot I wasn't exposed to growing up. And so I've been playing catch up, which is fine. It doesn't take that long to get a framework for things. Then it's about actually looking at your own psychological edges and what's your specific calling and how to bring that out. But yeah, it was, I had direct experience of contact, I guess. I'm like, oh, there are things that aren't human that are smart and powerful. Weird.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
that's fascinating. I wasn't that much of a stoner. Still definitely got stoned. Maybe I was, but I had a similar, perhaps, experience with teenage LSD use and to some extent marijuana, which was there is a better way of doing this, like in a ritual sense, because typically, typically it was, when friends' parents were out of town and, they had an empty house, we'd go and get off our faces there, right? And so whilst it would be pleasant and kind of fun to explore these things, at the time I had the sense that there's a better way of doing this, and I'm not sure what it was. So I kind of looked for a ritual framework in the sense of that. But I know what you mean about the pushback, which was I'm experiencing this, and I could be experiencing it better, and I'm not sure what that looks like.
Oh, yeah. Well, ritual, people can bristle at the structure and the authority elements of established traditions, but if you're going to just jump up and down, you don't need any advanced technology. If you're going to fly in a commercial jet, you need some tech. If you're going to fly in a spaceship, you need some next level tech. And so there are certain kinds of ritual maneuvers that if you're going to pull them off, it really behooves a person to look at what the ancestors have come up with and to deal with all the stuff you got to deal with to be a part of established traditions, to get access to the technologies. And so established traditions are kind of accumulated ancestral wisdom for how to navigate those terrains.
That's a perfect way of putting it, because you can even, although there are some challenges with the extant evolutionary model, you look at it and go, well, over tens of thousands of years, this has been optimized. So why would you? Yeah, I agree completely. Like there's a tremendous amount of wisdom in medicine in looking at how we as humans have historically done these things, because over such a long timeline, we've probably got a few things right.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah. So, I mean, I have a question here, but I think we're kind of at that point. My question was, what came first, the spiritual quest or the professional career? But if it was a combination of, psychedelics and finding your first ritual teacher, I guess, at 17, I guess it was that. Was it always the case once you'd encountered these things that said, you know what, my life is definitely going to go in this direction? Or did you have a...
Yeah, it kind of was, actually. Once I got involved in ritual with teachers, I was like, I want to do this. I'm not sure what that looks like. I did a degree in religious studies, and then I did a master's in counseling, which was one of the best choices I could have made, because I almost did a PhD in religious studies or went to law school to try to do environmental activism, and I would have been more heady and less happy. And so training as a therapist and then doing a PhD in psychology was grounding and good for me. But all along I was training in how to do ritual, and I didn't have a good map of how to make that into a vocation necessarily, only that I saw that there's a need for those kinds of services and that kind of teaching, and that I'm drawn to it, so it must be possible. And then, so eventually it's worked out. And then in the last couple of years, it's been very satisfying. The approach to ancestral lineage healing work that I've developed and started teaching to others in 2004, 2005. In the last few years, I've started to train others in how to guide that. And it's really working. It's nice. It's nice to see other people supporting their families, helping their clients to get right with their ancestors.
Yeah, it's wonderful stuff. I got the book pretty much close to when it came out, to be honest. But before we get to there, you mentioned ancestors. So was the quest concurrent with the development of a professional career? And I guess when did you decide to take the quest components of it seriously enough to learn from active traditions? Because if you look at Mahayana, Yoruba traditions and so on, like tell us about that bit. Was it the realization that the best way for you to do this was to, travel and get initiated and that kind of stuff?
Well, yeah, I'm kind of ambitious, which I actually see is not necessarily a harmful quality. In a way that I'm drawn to knowledge and, I guess, power used well. Because if you're afraid to engage with power, you're not going to get too much done. And so I was drawn to what works in ritual. And so I noticed, like, being around the fire at big pagan gatherings, that the people from the voodoo temple, I'm like, whoa, what do they got going on? They got something going on that these other people don't got going on. That's interesting. I'm interested in it. And then I noticed in my studies of Islam, for example, that there's power and beauty in established tradition. So I spent some time living as a Muslim in North Africa, or I was involved in Zen practice, because there's potency in the retreats and in the practice. And so in a sense, I was just drawn to what works. And if that meant working within certain parameters, I'm like, oh, whatever. That's just the tithing or the price of entry, is to be in relationship with the traditions. And eventually, after 16 years, really, of being around the tradition, I finally decided to step in more formally with Yoruba traditions, partly not because there's this ancient soul level calling with the Orisha, or because I even vibe with it that much, but because there's just such a compatibility. It's like you have all this layers of life, and then you look over and the person who's your best friend is like, oh, we're actually a good match. Why don't we get married?
I love it.
So it was a bit more practical in that way. And so it's metaphysically, and, it's a good match on a lot of levels. So I'm content. It's good for me. It's good for any leader person, but it's good for me because I'm a little ambitious to be in a tradition where at most I'm just going to be a medium-sized fish in a big pond full of weird old wizards who would crush me in a wizard battle. So it's good training to be medium-sized at best.
It's a way of moderating the ambition so you can use the good parts of it.
Mm-hmm. And to just be in an environment where I'm always going to be learning. I'm never going to bottom out with this. That's something I respect about established traditions. As much as they can get contorted and dysfunctional and power trippy, often when they're working, there's access to lineage and to inherited forms. And those have been, as you were saying, field tested, often over a long period of time. And that, once you get comfortable and you have the right permissions ancestrally to work with those forms, that's cool. You can ritually get more done.
So was the, looking back on it, maybe is a better way of thinking about this, but was the call of the ancestors and the call to, I guess, reconnect disconnected people with lineages there from the beginning, do you think? Or was it a realization that happened somewhere along the many quests?
Yeah, I started first engaging the ancestors, my own ancestors of blood, in the late 90s at the encouragement of my first teachers, Becky and Crow at the Church of Earth Healing, and Crow's now passed. But it was just one day a ritual, but it was a really potent seed that was planted. And it helped in my own recovery of cultural self-esteem and a sense of place and valuing of family. And then I went in another direction, and I became a kind of arrogant, I found the truth, Muslim convert, and then my life got shattered a bit, so I started sitting in Zen practice and did other things until I came back around to re-engage the spirits that I, for a period of time, was too cool to talk to. And they were like, how's it going, buddy? Where'd you go? And so I came back into that conversation. I haven't left it since, but what I gradually started to see, I saw pieces of it early on, but then I started to see the implications of ancestral reconnection for healing around racism, the history of colonialism, especially, but not only in the Americas, just because that's my lived experience, around sexism and all the troubles around homophobia, transphobia, things like that. The cultural troubles we're trying to metabolize around dysfunctional patterns. They're ancestrally generated troubles that are more effectively transformed in partnership with the ancestors. And the ancestors change. And so the people who were shits during life and made those troubles might actually be really disposed to help in remedying them now as part of their own evolution. And so seeing some of the implications of that, I'm like, oh my, like there's a whole lot of really awesome, well-meaning activists and change working people who aren't drawing on the resource of the ancestors and those relationships as much as they could be. And so it's in the last 5-6 years, the piece around cultural healing and belonging and all that, and you could say it's a kind of decolonization work that's been more foreground, and that's really satisfying. It's good. It's needed.
Yeah, it's amazing stuff. I love the circular journey. I've been on a similar one myself, of leaving the stuff I'm definitely too cool to be dealing with, and then exploring other things, and then you kind of come back. And this is such a fruitful conversation because let me back it up. So there's a Jungian analyst who I heard on speaking of Jung a little while ago, and she said that one of the biggest impacts in your life from a Jungian perspective is the unlived lives of parents. So when we're talking about, particularly in where we are in the 21st century now, when we're talking about the manifestations of homophobia and transphobia and racism and so on, how is that ancestrally? What are the ancestral implications of that? Is it mere inertia, or is there something else going on there?
Well, speaking from my own position as a fairly privileged cisgendered American white guy, my family was just a generation away from very working class survival oriented consciousness. Now, that doesn't dismiss the harms of the larger occupation of the Americas, but my own specific lineages, these are working class farmers, coal miners, soldiers, salt of the earth kind of people. And so they were just emerging from that in my parents' generation. And then I ended up being drawn specifically to Native North American ceremonial ways. So I've spent a lot of time sitting in ceremony with Lakota tradition and Native American church, although I don't lead with that per se. And then West African spirituality, which I come into contact with through the history of slavery and genocide, the double genocides upon which the United States is founded and hasn't reckoned with yet toward Native peoples and African peoples. And so, ancestrally speaking, it's provided I navigate it consciously, it's a kind of corrective in a way to humble myself at the foot of Native folks and African folks and traditions and ancestors, and learn from those and see that they come with antidotes for how to unravel a colonialist mindset, because the colonialism hasn't ended. No. It's still an attitude, still a stance, and it's still in this, like, animist traditions are more primitive or less sophisticated. I'm like, that's so racist. And so it's a funny thing to leverage whatever privilege is structurally afforded to me to try to dispel that and point people toward the voices directly of African folks, Native folks, etc. People feel confused. Why are you getting on a plane to go to Nigeria to train with people there? I'm like, that's an understandable question. And because they have wisdom and perspective and traditions that I can learn from that help me to be a better person. Yeah. It's,
there's some very obvious parallels. Now, this is a really good conversation because there's certainly tension points that I think need to be navigated consciously, to use your words. A similar thing happens with my praxis now that I'm back in Australia, which is, whilst certainly not being, an Aboriginal Australian or an initiate into any of those kind of things that are not necessarily available to colonial descendants like myself, I will still open ceremony with structural learnings from my increasing understanding of Aboriginal cultures, so acknowledgement of country and so on. And a similar thing happens with some of the Chinese charm stuff. So because we have Australia's still racist, but we have a long history of racism that doesn't have the exact pattern that the US one does, but there are similarities there, and there is something about it, and I'll see if you can answer this for me, there is something about using these things intentionally that is, I feel, decolonizing. And is it merely that the combination of elevating people in my lineage who were either beneficiaries or presumably perpetrators of some of this stuff, and kind of incorporating them in a way that allows them to see the vitality and beauty of the things that they couldn't when they were alive. Is that enough? Is that a good enough description, or is there more going on there?
Yeah, yes, I follow it. I don't know if we're ever doing enough necessarily, but I think of a moment 2 trips ago to Nigeria, to Yoruba land, and I'm a student of the language as well, and these guys I've been doing ritual with for some years now, there was a moment where I just wanted to say something to them. We're back in Igbodu, so like the Sacred Grove area, and I'm like, I was like, I want to say something to you. Everyone gets real quiet. It makes me completely nervous because Yoruba people are pretty direct, and for my temperament. And so I said a little bit for a few minutes in my broken Yoruba, and everyone got quiet, and they're like, "Oh, okay." So they appreciated it. And then things went on. Everyone kept drinking their beer. But then one of the elders got up and gave a little talk that was pointed to the young people. And I asked for translation later. They basically said, hey, if this Oyinbo can come in here and speak your language, you better learn it. If this person is going to learn your tradition, you better value it. And it was an interesting moment of being sort of beneficially co-opted as an outside like authority figure in some ways to reflect back to the young people the value of their own traditions. And so it's not from this white savior mindset, but it's saying if we're conscious about our position, we can convey respect and flip the story of what's being valued. And I think that our own ancestors benefit from being a part of that repair through us. I think that's very much possible. And the earth, the land, is the bigger authority. If you are in really good relationship with the land and you're giving respect to the land, then the ancestors whose bodies have become the earth and who are one of the animating forces of the big calabash that's the earth, they're going to look well upon you, even if some of the living people are like, Gordon, you're being a weird white guy, or whatever. And so the spirits of the land can endorse something even when the living humans get a little bent out of shape about it.
Yeah, that's wonderful and definitely aligns with my experience. But it brings up the question, which I think is another fruitful discussion. What actually are the ancestors? And kind of like, we use these categorizations, fair enough, but what are some useful categorizations of thinking with and interacting with ancestors, place, bloodline, etc.? Like let's have that conversation about helpful frameworks, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a big question, but let me say a few general distinctions that inform how I approach it, which I don't claim to be universal, but I think there are definitely some cross-cultural elements. I'm trying to hold what I'm teaching as cross-culturally as possible so that folks are getting like a reinfusion of ancestor reverence fundamentals that they can then adapt to different settings. And so one distinction is that not all among the dead are equally well or at peace. So ancestors, if we use it in the broadest sense, run the whole spectrum from deified ancestors who are potent just to be around to really troubled ghosts who can wreck your happiness and safety. And so in that way, they're like the living. They run the full spectrum from dangerous to awesome, and sometimes a little bit of both. And more narrowly, I'll tend to refer to the ancestors as those among the dead who are relatively at peace and safe in theory to relate with, unlike the ghosts or the not yet ancestors. So that's one important distinction. And then another is that how are we in relationship with them? There are ancestors of blood or of body, of bone, which I think I have the view that we have an inherent in with our ancestors of blood, even if we haven't been raised with them. That doesn't mean we can necessarily represent those cultures, but I do think it's fair game to seek to relate consciously with them. There's ancestors of spiritual traditions that we seek out or are adopted by. There's ancestors of the land, which we're often not related to by blood if our ancestors have been moving around in more and less consensual ways. But if you're in a place, even if your people didn't arrive there very consciously, it is still possible to come with etiquette and a conscientious mindset. So those are a few different groupings of ancestors. There are others. And I guess one other thing I'd say is the tendency in the modern Western folks is to think of the dead as the recent ones and as individuals. And a lot of traditionalists, generally speaking, think of the ancestors as groups or collectives, and that include, and not just include, but the majority of them are ones who are no longer remembered by name. And so the vast majority of the ancestors are before specific remembered names of the last, say, 2 to 10 generations. Those are just the visible part of the ocean you can see at the beach. So they're a whole huge demographic. It's all the human consciousness. When I say ancestors, I tend to refer to human consciousness. Of course, it can include the stones, the land, the eagles, the trees, all of it. But a bit more narrowly, if we say ancestors are all the human that's not in form, physically incarnate right now. So it's that half of the calabash that's in the unseen. And with all the incarnate ones, that's the shape of human.
Yeah, it's definitely a useful, I guess, therapeutic distinction. Just to bring up a couple of these, funnily enough, when I was writing Chaos Protocols, and there's components in there about working with the dead and initial approaches to ancestors. And I thought, you know what, I'm not going to... It makes sense to me, and I don't need to mention, not that many people are adopted. They can work out that you kind of have double sets of ancestors. And it turns out my editor was, in fact, adopted, and she emailed right back and said, what about people who are adopted? So we'll give you the question that is the same there. And in particular, where you mention there is and this has been my experience too, there is an easier initial in to bloodline ancestors. Now, how do we navigate that in situations where we don't actually know them? Because one of the things I like about your structure, particularly in the book, is the distinction between like the named and unnamed dead as a really useful horizon. So when we're talking about, let's just do the adoption question. If it is true, and it's certainly been my experience, that you have an easier initial in with bloodline ancestors, how do you do that when they're all unnamed dead?
Of course, the horizon is just a bit closer, right? And it requires trust in one's instinct and intuitive knowing right up front. But having said that, even adoptees will, and it's not to minimize the pain that is often but not always a part of adoptees' experience. Having said that, people who have some knowledge of their ancestors, whether it's 2 or 10 generations, still hit a wall of unknowing eventually. And the majority of what I encourage people to work with ritually is still beyond that wall. And so in some ways, adoptees have an advantage because they're not going to project 7 generations of family knowledge onto the much older field of ancestral consciousness before that. And adoptees are going to naturally have different levels of resonance with their adoptive family, well, and biological family for that matter. But in general, the approach of honoring both is the way I go also. And a thorough outcome is that an adoptee could come into direct, conscious, excellent, healed relationship with their ancestors of blood, and then with them together communicate a big gesture ritually of respect, assuming that's the feeling about it, to one's adoptive family for the gift of the time and energy and love to raise the person. And so I don't want to reinforce a heavy emphasis on blood too much, because that can be its own kind of colonialist, weird, misused construct. And ritually speaking, there's something on a very visceral bone and blood and body level that does link us magically to our ancestors of body. The other piece I'd add in here is that what we think of as a soul, I resonate with the traditions that I've encountered, which is quite a few, that tend to construct what we think of as a soul as multiple, as a convergence of different energies. So there's the blood or bone soul, the soul that's shaped by this life experience, the one that's shaped by previous incarnations from other times and places. And so we're a composite of different things. And there's enough room for the all of the above approach in how we hold it.
You absolutely find, and it's coming back to the notion that animism is primitive being the most preposterous of ideas. I find that multi-part soul component a useful comparison notion to what you were just talking about earlier as ancestors in traditional lifeways, very commonly seen as groups or as a collective, because you kind of have the fluidity of, how to describe this, the fluidity of being able to interact in a meaningful way without having to have at the front of your mind a structure of like, well, have they reincarnated or how many pieces of this or what have you. And once you get those two ideas humming in your head, ritually or performatively, you kind of, it's almost the most natural thing in the world once that happens, once you start to get those connections. But let's talk about, I just wanted to drop that in there because I want to talk about the notion of ancestors or lineages as groups, even if we are using that as a therapeutic device, and also to kind of go back to what you mentioned earlier, the difference between ancestors and not yet ancestors, and how these two ideas work from a healing perspective.
The idea that we're isolated individuals is such a dysfunctional, lonely, isolating bunch of nonsense that doesn't check out with anything metaphysically or scientifically or culturally or whatever. And so, things are, we're one of the only creatures who can become so out of touch with the reality that we're a group organism. It looks structurally to me like a mushroom being like, I don't know anything about the mycelium. I'm not connected to that. I know myself. I'm just here. And the mycelium is just like, really, dude? Okay, you go on believing that. That's cool. So the ancestors in that sense are the mycelium. They're the root structure. They're the rhizome that our individual face is an expression of. That's weird psychologically a bit. And it's nice. It's kind of a relief. It's kind of a dissolving agent on our sense of identity if we're not careful, or if we're into that. And it's one of the reasons I enjoy the lineage level of scale, because it encourages people to really carve out and activate and get to know different archetypal or sacred qualities or deity-like qualities along different lineages, and then try to hold those in a harmonized or team or internal council kind of way. But it's not just internal, of course. We're just the overlap of these big, different convergent energies that move along the bloodlines. So how does that work? How does that intersect the process of ancestralization, whereby death is the start of a rite of passage that doesn't really complete until someone's been received by and well seated among the ancestors? And part of how it intersects is that the dead ideally become part of a group consciousness, or they're welcomed back into the organism that they're derived from, in a sense, as part of that team. And if that doesn't happen, you get a sort of fragmented, like a ghost energy, basically, like an individual who is splintered and is not yet reoriented or re-anchored in the source energy. Good funerals around the world are designed to make sure the dead transition. I tried to explain to my Yoruba teacher, it's a Lubofalo Adesanya Bogede in Oderema in Ogun State in Nigeria, and we had good fortune to host him here in Western North Carolina a year or two ago. I was trying to explain to him my work, and they don't totally get it because they don't have the same intergenerational epidemic ghost problem. So he's listening. He's like, okay, Baba, I get it. I kind of get it. I'm like, what's the Yoruba word for ghost? He's like, well, they were kind of stretching. Like, it wasn't, you mean like someone who commits suicide and isn't very happy after they die? I'm like, yeah, kind of. And so they kind of get it. But then he told a story which revealed a lot about it, of somebody, his father, who was very elder, knew when his father was younger. So an auntie of his father died. And she was dead for like a day. And she had an experience while she was dead for that day of approaching the gates of the other world. And there was one of her aunties who had been dead for years sitting outside those gates. And she said to the more recently deceased person, hey, they didn't do my funeral rites well. I'm still not settled. You go back and tell them to handle it. So then the person who had been dead for just a day sat up, scared everybody to death, and was like, hey, I got this message. You need to also do the funeral rites for this person. All right, peace. I'm going to go back to being dead. And so they handled the funeral rites for both people. And my teacher's like, you mean like that? And I was like, yeah, that's what I mean. Except for a lot of white people got a whole bunch of people sitting outside.
Oh, yeah. That's, yeah.
He's like, oh, okay.
It's like that one story multiplied by millions of people.
He's like, oh, okay, Baba. Now I see. You have job security. Carry on.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the kind of great tragedies of Western cosmology. We used to know this. We used to know this in the archaic and classical Greek world, that the best way to get ghosts is to not bury people correctly, or, you know, and there were very specific rules about it. In fact, it goes back to Babylon. You have medical books that are actual entire lists of, like, well, here's your symptom, it's this kind of ghost, go and do that. And we used to be very precise and know this. And that sort of begs the next question. Is there a difference between, well, I guess there is cosmically, but let's just talk about it therapeutically. Is there a difference between ghost effects in your life from, say, the not yet ancestors, and can we just distinguish them from, like, the life effects that might be indications of damaged lineage or lineage in need of repair? Because that kind of jumps the line between nameless and named dead again.
It's a very perceptive question. Poetically, there's no difference. Ritually, I do make a distinction between what, and I don't even have the best language for this, but I tend to describe it as direct or indirect influence. Indirect is like your down lineage from a pattern, and the degree of impact might be really quite high. But it's not a given that there's also direct ghost interference, meaning that the dead who created that pattern and are still dwelling within it are also up in your space. You could have a sibling, and let's say your father was a terribly abusive alcoholic, and you're totally down lineage from a ancestrally generated kind of trouble. But your father, who is still ghosty, is actually all around your sister, not you. And so the specific souls or spirits of the dislocated dead might not be up in your space, but the impact from the legacy pattern might be. So they are ritually, on a pragmatic level, it's relevant to make a distinction. But poetically, sure, like colonialism itself is a ghost problem. And all, modern exploitative capitalism is climate change is the expression of the atmosphere being clogged with the troubled dead. And so there's, poetically, all that stuff is also true. But you're asking as a ritualist, and so I'm saying, yeah, there's a distinction.
Yeah, what has been my observation, being amongst magically operant people, is they'll often try and cure one, or they'll diagnose it as being direct or ghostly, and that may in fact be part of it. But if it's indirect, if it's lineage pattern, the challenge just represents, like, in many respects, ghosts are very easy to get rid of.
No doubt. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And but if you're dealing with lineage patterns and its impact on your life and your wider family life, that's a lot more work. But also, it's very commonly misdiagnosed as it might be the ghost of your terribly abusive alcoholic father still being around your sister. It's like, yeah, that's true. He's actually very easy to get rid of. Well, he is comparatively easy to get rid of compared to actually working with the impact of the lineage pattern.
That's right. And what I find additionally is that if we dig deep enough in the lineage, one of the best places to get the medicine or the antidote or the corrective quality, which still isn't embodied quickly, but is within the lineage itself. If you track back far enough, the trouble is typically the distortion of the blessing. And so if you can understand what the troubled pattern sourced from and go just before that, to before things got off track, those specific types of blessings and it are often, not always, but often what's needed to be embodied in the present in order to retrain the nervous system and the psyche to not be a ghost receptacle anymore.
The techniques that are funny, you mentioned the mushroom as a metaphor, because your lineage repair techniques that are in your book, I have my modifications of them are based on several mushroom journeys where I was using mushrooms to get as far back as I could from a lineage perspective, like right to the edge of being human. And it's weird to see those two. It's weird that you use that metaphor in this discussion, but like,
I want to see your field notes.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely, at least initially, it is a unrecorded conversation. But so what might some of the life effects be? Let's just go to the lineage repair stuff, because it's fascinating, and I'm so glad that you have the combination of the sort of professional certificates and the experience of it, because there is something about doing lineage repair work the first time or the first couple of times where it's kind of like going into therapy, where it's almost like you get 60% of the medicine the first time you do it. It's like the first breath of air back up those lines, and then the other remaining 40% transforms as an ongoing process of lineage repair. So it's just this, if no one's ever done it before because they haven't thought with this useful therapeutic framework of how we can interact with our ancestors. Let's kind of do what's an example of how would you select a lineage, and should we just do it before kind of diagnosing if we have lineage challenges? Let's kind of go with what are some good first steps beyond obviously getting the book, and how that might look. Yeah,
part of when I wrote the book as a how-to book, I'm like, oh, geez, I'm giving away the cookbook. Good luck, folks. And I figured that the benefits outweigh the harms of just giving away the tech. And if you give some away, Spirit will put something else in its place, so it's fine. And I make the process quite structured to try to achieve a higher level of ritual safety, because the dead who are not yet at peace can be a real source of interference and trouble. And getting into that terrain can stir things up a little. But like humans, the dead are dangerous to engage, but they're also dangerous to avoid. So, if we approach well, it's okay. I used to encourage people to begin with the lineage that is least well in spirit. It's embarrassing in a way to name that, but I have since learned over time that such a oddly Protestant work ethic might not be the best approach, and that going to where there's relatively more health and wellness among one's ancestral lineages is a good starting point. And from there to recruit the healed, whole quality of those ancestors to support and work with other lineages. The basic method, of course, is to connect with the ones before the troubles, the much older ancestors in most cases, and to ask them to carry out the ancestralization, the healing, the welcoming in of any among the dead who are not yet well on the lineage between those old ones and us. And so another thing about the approach that folks often struggle with is it's not an effort-based approach. We're not the ones doing the work. It's really about calling in the ancestors and saying, please help. What would you like me to do? And if they're like, we need you to sit there and pray and set out a cup of water every day, and that'll be good. Then you do it like that, because they're the ones doing the heavy lifting. And there can be a sense that we're not doing enough. Well, but it's actually ritually more effective and safer to let them handle it.
Yeah, it's what they're for. It feels, it's the most amazing thing, because you think, well, this shouldn't work as well as it does, especially initially. And that's what's...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me say one other thing about it is folks, understandably, coming out of an inner work psychology background, have this is going to be hard. I know my family was dysfunctional, so taking on this is going to be difficult. Parentheses, if it's not difficult, it's not worthwhile. Parentheses, it's all happening through my effort. Even more unconscious parentheses, I'm alone in the universe. And so to flip that, this isn't actually inner work. The inner work component is a byproduct. If we are going upstream and repairing a source of contamination, if where we're at downstream eventually gets flushed out and is better, great, bonus. But it's secondarily inner work, so it means that emotional intensity isn't the indicator of effectiveness necessarily. Sometimes it's actually kind of underwhelming, but then things start to shift in the family, or there's all kinds of unexpected things that happen.
Yeah, unexpected things that happen in the wider world. It's as you say, it's not even like going through therapy where the transformations are inner. It's all of a sudden people's businesses clear up a little more and so on. It's the impression I have of having done this for a little while is it does feel like the easiest thing in the world. The ancestors, particularly when you're up at that more elevated and earlier points in the timeline, this is what they do. This is the natural functioning of the mycelium. So it is. It is. Yeah.
And there is there's not any environmental problems. There's just human stupidity and confusion and oppression and suffering. Not saying oppression is a function of stupidity, but human behavior problems are the sum of the environmental problems. And so insofar as the really elevated, deified, top-notch ancestors are not separate from the other than humans, they're also the face of nature. They understand that the crisis that we've generated and are deepening into requires a quick, if possible, overhaul of human confusion to bring things back into some semblance of balance. And so there's an urgency as well. And you can't be urgent about inner work. You kind of have to be like spacious and slow down and everything. But it's like that slow down, get calm within the burning house so you know how to proceed.
Yeah, I like it. This is also moving further up once you get past, once you get to the more elevated ranks of ancestors, is also the solve for the other question I'm sure you get asked every time, along with the adoption question, which is, what do I do if I come from several generations of abusive trash? And this is where anyone can jump up. You move further up the timeline to where they are much more at a teacher and protector level and come back down, don't you?
That's right. Yeah, you start by having a boundary with the abusive trash, because in 9 out of 10 cases, when people say that, they mean it. Occasionally, they're just like being a little dramatic and feel misunderstood by their family when their family's actually kind of kind, but just not meeting their expectations. But most of the time, people mean it. And they're accurate. But what I would say is I've never met anyone who comes from 85 generations in a row of abusive trash. And so the odds of that are just really low. And so you go back as far as you need to in the lineage to find someone who's an actual grown-up. And then you're like, yo, we got serious issues down here. They're like, yeah, I noticed that. I was hoping you would ask some generation. And then you ask them to step in and bring accountability. Accountability is so inseparable from love and belonging. And the dead who are wayward and still in a confused dream that they set in motion by being harmful during life, part of what they often unconsciously are longing for is accountability for their actions, which is the way by which they get woven back in. And so when we ask the elder ancestors to step in, we're saying, could you please reel in these wayward, harmful ghosts that have been showing up poorly along this lineage? And the ones who have been harmful often are really receptive to that, because they've tried on a few hundred years of living in a 24/7 confusing bad dream that they can't wake up from or get out of. And so when you've had that experience and somebody's like, hey, you want to try a different thing? A lot of the dead are like, sure, what is it?
Yeah, I like that. That's very profound. That the what they're waiting for or looking for is accountability, especially once you end up dead. They do.
We crave it. In Yoruba culture, the ritual society of Ogboni or Oshogbo that gives reverence specifically to the Earth Mother is also, they're kind of like the police in the tradition in a sense, or there's a quality of enforcement of norms and all that. And the earth is an extension of the consciousness of the ancestors in part. And the sense is that for real belonging, accountability is required, and ethics and morality. We want it. We don't want to be alone and left out and not connected. It's terrible. It's a horrible kind of suffering to really feel deeply alone.
And particularly if you get that increased perspective once you have died, of the impact your actions in life had, you may, I've had this happen once long ago back in London, but you may actually mistake it for being in hell.
Sure.
And then I really like that idea of what they're after is accountability. So you sort of go further up and get elders to go, okay, work on this. They definitely need accountability, but let's get them on that process.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
So we've got this line, and this is actually kind of related. We've got this useful therapeutic line between the named and nameless dead. And as general best practice, given all the things we've been speaking about, is to go, further up to where you have ancestors as much more powerful and elder teacher types. What are some of the useful ways of assisting the remembered dead? The ones you do have names for.
Yeah, it proceeds in the work, in the session work and the training and the online course when we're actually moving through the method. Once one has come into a really attuned and grounded connection with the ancestral guides, the whole well-healed part of the lineage, I try to be as sparse as I can about what happens from that point, because I want to make sure that the ancestors themselves are guiding it. But the ancestralization or the assisting or the weaving in of the ones who are not yet ancestors tends to happen a bit at a time, because we're working on repairing the lineage as a system. And so that could look like one ancestor getting woven in or a group of them. It typically proceeds from the older ones toward the more recent ones, so that the ones closest to the living person, parents, grandparents, are among the last to be received. So if your grandfather was a really destructive human during life, you don't even work with him ritually until his father and all the men before him are well seated and at peace and ready to receive him. And even then, we get out of the way of it. But sometimes the ancestors will want the living person to be involved and up in it. Sometimes they'll be like, look, we're going to handle this. You're going to hear some crashing noises. You just look the other way. We'll tell you when it's done. So it depends on how much the living person really needs to understand the story or view some of the trauma about how it got to be that way. Offerings can help. Holding the vision of the dead actually becoming well is helpful. Engaging in practices of forgiveness and trying to become emotionally current from our side about past harms, that can help. And really just listening closely to the ancestors and doing the things that they suggest. Sometimes they'll be like, make this donation, or go dance in this way, or put a white flower on so-and-so's grave, or, so whatever they ask, if it's within reason, it's good to follow that. They'll show what's needed.
Yeah. Well, that's might actually end up being quite a useful final question. What is something, obviously, for people who want to go further, they can get the book, they can do the online courses and all the stuff we're about to talk about. But what is a really good step one, a really good universal step one for people who are like, yeah, this is definitely a thing I need to embark upon, that we can sort of leave people with at the end of the show?
I like to encourage folks within a circle of their own protection, sovereignty, personal space, and boundaries to see beyond that circle a big field of energies that are their ancestors of blood, and to recognize within that large demographic that spans out over many, many, many generations that a lot of those folks are not very at peace at all. A lot of them are kind of in between, and there's some of them who are really quite wise and kind, even if they're not recent ones. They might be, but a lot of them are older. And it's possible to basically say, hey, wise, loving, kind elders, I invite you to draw close to the edge of my circle. Those who are other than healed, I invite you respectfully to be just a little more spacious here and back up a little from the circle. And then to hold the intent at a pace and intensity level that's good for any given person, to be in direct influence and relationship with what is loving and kind and wise from one's own ancestors. And what plays out from there is going to be unique for each person, but to know that those relationships, they're our birthright. They're not that spiritual. They're not that high tech. It doesn't make you this or that kind of person. But it's totally possible and nourishing and enjoyable and down to earth to be in direct relationship with what's beautiful, loving, kind, and good about your people.
Yeah, that's a fantastic one. That's really good. All right, well, I absolutely love this stuff. I absolutely love it. The book is fantastic. Daniel, let us know what you got coming up, and for people who want to know more, a bit about the book, website, courses, appearances, because there is one coming up that I'm quite looking forward to. Lay it on us.
I'm headed to Australia for the first time with my family, and we'll be in Mullumbimby in New South Wales in early April for a 3-day intensive, and then in Melbourne after that for another 3-day intensive, and talks in each place. And after those, for an intensive in Hawaii, in Oahu, with co-led with a Hawaiian elder and traditionalist, Kuma Ramsey Tom. And then I'll be teaching in Europe in a number of countries in the summer. There's also an online course in animism and practical animism, Earth Reconnection, starting in May. And a great bunch of practitioners trained in this work, a few of whom are in Australia, and all of whom offer Skype video online sessions, including low-income sessions. And probably some other stuff I'm not thinking of, hours of free talks on the website and information about different things. So trying to create different pathways of access and engagement for folks who are drawn to the reconnection work. But it would be great to share in ritual space with folks in Australia when I'm there. I'm excited to greet the land and people and ancestors for the first time.
Yeah, we were talking about it. The Melbourne one is really well placed. I know the venue for the kind of work that's going to be done, and Mullumbimby certainly has a particular energy that will make that very fruitful, and it definitely needs it. So for people who are in Australia and especially the Mullumbimby adjacent ones, because I did just do a couple of shows up in that general area, absolutely check it out. This is real good stuff. And website. Oh, so the book is Ancestral Medicine, Rituals for Personal and Family Healing. This and the events will be in the show notes. But other stuff about you and where people can find you, Daniel?
Ancestralmedicine.org is where all the information's at. And if people want to connect on social media, that's fine. But it's all there on the website, ancestralmedicine.org. So
Fantastic. And it will, of course, all be in the show notes.
that's so good, Gordon. I'm happy to chat with you, and I look forward to meeting real soon. Thank you.
So the premium members will definitely get why this episode came out when it did. But for everyone else, conversations such as these are always timely, because at the very least, there's still a heck of a lot more Saturn in Capricorn to go. But also, and this came up several times in the Magical Geography course, and I also touch on it briefly in the context of the saints in Pieces of 8, but the risk of blood and soil ethno-nationalism and all that nonsense is not an excuse to avoid this sort of work. It's in fact a very reason to do it, to not abandon the discourse to the, assholes of the world. From a reenchantment perspective, the only way out of this particular sort of morass is through. And Daniel's work very much aligns with that, with the kind of cosmic post-colonial turn. So even if you don't try out the exercise Daniel described at the end of our discussion, and of course I recommend that you do, at the very least, it's worth sitting quietly with your own opinions on the role of the various types of ancestors: blood, place, spiritual tradition, cultural, whatever that means, and so on. And that is just to sort of get right in your own head a very high-level step one framework. In Daniel's book and his courses, there is a much more elaborate one, of course, geared toward being as medicinally useful an approach as possible for the sometimes fraught experience of interacting with the dead, however you happen to conceive of them. So check out the book, the online courses, the in-person ones, all of that's in the show notes. And for Australians, the Mullumbimby workshop is the one to keep an eye on. For the Melbourne one that I'm attending is currently waitlist only. And that's the show for this week. Feel free to share. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think at the RuneSoup Facebook page or runesoup.com. Subscribe in your favorite podcatcher. And as always, find me on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.